This is an interview with Gerard Morrisey, conducted by Collin Capurso on June 19, 2025. Gerard's family heritage spans continents, with deep roots tracing back to Irish immigrants who arrived in the 1850s and Dutch ancestors who settled in nearby Rochester. Growing up on a farmhouse on Latin Road beside West Transit Church Road, Gerard experienced firsthand the rhythms of agricultural life, from tomato farming for Hunt's ketchup to apple orchards, shaped by the seasonal cycles that defined his family's daily routine. His upbringing was closely intertwined with his Catholic faith in the St. Joseph's community, which provided both spiritual grounding and a sense of identity amid challenges, including instances of discrimination targeting immigrant and Catholic families in the area. Gerard reflects on these experiences with honesty, highlighting how they've shaped his understanding of community and resilience. Through vivid anecdotes about farm life, local characters, and the joys and hardships of working the land, Gerard offers a window into a way of life that has evolved but remains deeply connected to the region's history. His long-standing involvement with the local museum and his role as scoutmaster further reflect his commitment to preserving community traditions and fostering connection. In this interview, Gerard not only shares his personal memories, but also insights about what it means to be a lifelong local, honoring the past while witnessing the changes that have shaped the community over time. First and foremost, we'll talk about family and your background. What can you tell me about your family's roots, where your parents and grandparents came from, and how they ended up in this area?
My father's grandparents were born in Ireland, and they emigrated to this area as the potato famine hit, and settled in farming areas to the north of here, and they worked for the Billings family, the Morriseys did, from about 1852. And they continued to be in this area and continued to have interaction with different families. They moved to the Latin Road farm in 1929. And let me tell about the Ricky family and the burning the...
Oh, don't worry, that's in there.
That's just in there farther? Okay. So that was, and that's the farm that I grew up on the Latin Road in town of Gaines.
And then regarding your father's side, especially the Morriseys coming, your mother's family, contrarily, came from the Netherlands and settled in Rochester, as you mentioned. What stories did she share about the immigrant experience and growing up in this area?
My grandmother Polma was born in the northeastern Netherlands in a farm area, and they immigrated, various families immigrated when she was 5 years old and stayed with relatives in Rochester. And the Polmas were also on the ship. They came from the same part of Province Groningen in the Netherlands. And the Polma brothers, who were on the same ship, worked in Rochester and then worked on the farms outside of Rochester to learn American farming. And the Great Depression of the 1890s struck, and farms were foreclosed on, and the Polma brothers had saved some money, and they went to the savings banks in Rochester and said what farms were available. And the one that they were shown, one of the ones they were shown was here at East Gaines on Ridge Road. And they bought that farm, and the man who was foreclosed on, there'd been a Billings farm far back, Timothy Billings, and the man who was foreclosed on was a relative of the Morriseys and from Ireland, and just got there at a very difficult time. So there were ties to that farm on both sides, and eventually the two Polma brothers who farmed on Ridge Road married my grandmother Jenny Vink and her sister Anna Vink, and they grew up on they lived on adjacent farms and raised their families there.
Very nice. And yourself, you grew up on a farmhouse on Latin Road. What can you tell me about that kind of stuff? Living there, the work that you may have done, any memories from your childhood?
I can remember that we still, when I was growing up, we still had pigs, chickens, sheep, cows. We milked cows, and so gradually they thinned that out. I can remember milking a cow, and I was about 5 years old, and these huge stainless steel buckets that you put under the cow. And so I'm a little kid, and I'm milking the nice cow, and my father's milking the next cow where he had to chain the legs up so it wouldn't kick you. And but he gave me the good cow, and I'm so proud that I've got this beautiful bucket of milk, and I run around, and my father's seated on the stool is just at my height. That's how tall I was.
So you're probably small enough to get under pretty easily.
I'm about 5, and I tap him on the shoulder, and he turns around and jumps up, and I don't know what's wrong. I've left the bucket under the cow. The cow lifts his big foot up and goes plump into that beautiful, beautiful milk. Never going to forget that beautiful white milk and the cow's foot right.
Your masterpiece was
right
ruined.
Straight down there. The milking ruined. You're not going to be able to use that milk. So that was my my memory. And then we sold the cows off. We sold off pigs, kept sheep for a long time, and kept chickens for a long time.
Very nice. And then similarly, your father farmed tomatoes for the Hunt's ketchup factory and later moved on towards apples. What was his work like, and how did the seasonal cycles affect your family's life on the farm?
You really had to plan your year's work out. So he always had apples that he picked, and that was done from October, and then he picked up drops after that. Tomatoes were picked in September. So, and then they grew some winter wheat, which was that was harvested like the end of July, 1st of August. So it spread the workload out, and you planted the tomatoes in the spring. The winter wheat was planted in the fall. That grew up on its own, and you had to spray the apples. And then you went out, and they didn't have the herbicides you have now. You went out and hoed the tomatoes until they ripened in September, and that was as soon as the Hunt's factory in Albion opened in September, a great big board went up with every date on it, because you had to mark the schedule for hauling the apples in, and the factory ran around the clock, and so every time and date would be put up on this calendar, and the factory would call if there was like a boiler explosion. They'd shift the dates around, so you had to have the calendar there and mark it, and so there was just an around-the-clock hauling of apples and delivering them to Hunt's. I can remember very vividly. It was late in the season. It was late September, very wet and muddy. And my mother looked out and realized that my father had come back with a truck, and the truck was still full. That was a disaster. They turned the load down. It was so they sorted them. They weren't good enough. So very rarely did my mother go out to the barn, but she did then, because that was a real disaster, and had to sort those tomatoes and then take them up to try to hope they accepted them the next time, which they did. But and then when the tomatoes were done, then you started picking apples.
Yeah.
And you picked drop apples until the snow covered them, and you couldn't find them anymore.
Gotcha. That way you kind of have this cycle of tomatoes into apples and keep
Right.
the harvest going, so to speak.
And you hauled hay in the hot weather. So you're doing that before, and I would always be out, and the hired help that loaded the hay, they only had trick elbows. They could only load from one side of the wagon. And I realized after that was the side where the breeze was blowing. So I'd end up on the side of the wagon where the wagon blocked the breeze, and all you got was the chaff coming down your neck. And then when the wagon turned around, they still had the side with the nice breeze on it, and I was still getting the chaff down my neck here. I needed to develop a trick elbow that I didn't have.
They try to keep you tucked away, so to speak. And, other than maybe the breeze or perhaps the milk that the cow stepped in, what are some of the strongest memories that you may have of working on the farm as a kid? Other things in that realm, perhaps?
Well, certainly hauling hay and my father would grow either cucumbers or pickles. The long greens are the pickles, And he would take them over right across the way here to this barn where Al Zambito, I had a produce operation. And there were four of us, my uncle and my father, my brother and I, and my father would plant four acres of cucumbers, and you had to pick them every day. So every day you'd go out there and pick 1 acre apiece of cucumbers. And I'm tall, and you're bending over and you're scraping these things are sandpaper. And if you miss one, when you come back the next day, there's a giant orange. It just explodes into a giant orange thing, and there's no other cucumbers will grow around it because of that. So and my brother was a better picker than I was. He made sure that you got assigned to the same row, so that all your mistakes showed up on that every day. And the price shifted tremendously because for a pickle with a deli sandwich, you get a quarter of a pickle. And they don't care what it looks like. They don't care how much it costs. They put one quarter slice of pickle on a deli sandwich.
Yeah.
And so they will pay whatever the going price is. And it'll go all over. So you'd have, and you have to keep picking every day. You got to abandon it or you got to pick every day. And so you would go and you'd pick a lot of either pickles or the long greens, whatever they were, and you get a very low price, and they throw out most of them. And then when down in the Carolinas, they're competing. Florida and the Carolinas, they're competing pickle growing areas, and when there were storms, that crop went out, then the price shot up. So all of a sudden, every pickle went, and you got a good price, but you never knew when that was going to happen. You just had to have just keep picking and hope that the price shifted. So that was supply and demand that I learned.
Good lesson to have when you're a kid, so to speak.
Yeah.
No one can argue.
What happened was supply and demand.
And then, as we prepared for this interview and I was asking you some questions about things to ask, you mentioned the shift from kind of this general purpose farming to more specialized crops, such as the apples and tomatoes. And, looking at the cycles of crops coming through and stuff, what ended up causing that change from the general purpose to more specialized? And how did it affect your family's routine or perhaps their livelihood?
Well, there was just the farm my father had was 125 acres, which now would be a tiny farm, but that was, it was good soil, and it was a reasonably good farm when he started farming in the late 20s. And so the size of farms got bigger, the equipment got bigger, and the specialization got bigger. To have, like if you're growing string beans, or now snap beans, you called them string beans before, but then I call them snap beans because it sounds better. You had to have a contract for, I can't remember, 100 acres or more of beans. So you had to be bigger just to have a contract on this. So the factories wouldn't deal with you on a smaller basis. And so and I can remember the first automated bean picker that came in. It was on the bottom of a tractor with these, it spun and picked the beans. And before that, what we call string beans, snap beans, green beans, were picked multiple times. And with a picker, it destroyed the plant.
Oh, sure.
But it was automated. And so you had to change the breeding of the plant so that all the beans ripened at the same time. And it changed the amount of workers. It changed the whole structure of farming there.
And then, as someone that's been on a farm and was raised there for most of your life, what can you remember about seeing those changes in equipment and all these new innovations that might have made farming easier and maybe in some cases made it worse because you had to do more work? Are there any things that you've seen throughout your lifetime that have changed
just
the industry?
Gigantic machinery. My father had a Farmall C and a Farmall H tractor, and these are just hobby tractors by modern standards. And he had a combine that was attached to the tractor, which would be tiny by modern modern standards. The size of the equipment was, and the expense of the equipment was just beyond belief. You know, you had to be able to finance this stuff, or you couldn't farm. That was a tremendous load on that.
I'm sure.
And the rules and regulations that were there. A lot of the farmers around the area had gone to Cornell Ag School, and my father quit high school and as a junior and farmed. You know, he didn't. He was self-educated.
Gotcha.
You know, but he was annoyed by some of these Cornellians and all the. They got a little pompous sometimes, and when New York State required that you get a license to apply pesticides, he had to take an exam. Well, that was torture for him. He had to go and he knew the stuff because he used it all the time, but he had to go and
prove it.
He had to prove it on an exam, and he studied and studied and studied, and he passed the exam the first time, and there were some of the Cornellians that flunked because he didn't take it seriously enough, and he was quite pleased with himself that he'd.
Kind of shows the difference between actually living the experience versus just reading about it, so to speak. And when it comes to other farm work and stuff, as we prepared for this, you had mentioned to me that you didn't like doing the farm work, especially when you were younger. What were some of the chores that you dreaded doing the most?
Well, you'd always go out and you know, milking was twice a day. When we had cows, you had to milk them twice a day. So that was, and you know, the chickens had to be fed, and all the animals had to be fed, whether it's hard weather or not. You had to get out there and do that. Hauling hay was always hot weather. These you're out in hay, and it was, I had no use for hauling hay. My father would call and say, "You got to get out there before it gets hot." You know, this would be about 6 a.m. Well, you'd mumble into the pillow, it's already hot, you know? And so if a thunderstorm came up, there'd be rain pounding against the window that wash the hay out. You could sleep in. That was just wonderful. But you had to wipe the grin off your face going downstairs because that was not a happy
How dare
happy
you
thing.
look disappointed.
You had to look sad. You couldn't be too sarcastic, but you had to put a sour look on your face and pretend that this was unfortunate.
And then, similarly, do you remember a time, maybe a specific instance or anything, where a storm or bad weather had changed your farming plans? And was there anything that those moments taught you? And maybe not so much trying to wipe the grin off your face, but kind of the labor aspects or what it taught you about being behind by a day, anything along those lines?
Yeah, you never knew when the weather was going to change. You had to get out there and work like everything to get things done in case the weather changed. My grandmother Morrisey owned the farm, and she would stew about bad weather, which all farmers did, but she'd stew excessively. And they would never tell her when there was a forecast of bad weather because she would stew about it. But Charlie Rhodes, the neighbor, would call up and say, "Lizzie, have you heard the weather report?" and give a full weather report. Well, you're Catholic, you got out a holy candle and lit that holy candle and said some prayers here that the barn doors wouldn't blow off. I mean, that was that happened too.
I've lost many windows on my own barn.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned religion in this aspect, and you said that you went to a Catholic school all the way up to 8th grade, that your family was also part of St. Joseph's. How did your faith shape your upbringing?
Well, it was, you don't take off a Catholic background like a jacket. It's just embedded there, you know, and there's prayers and ritual that are there, and you just take it, you take it seriously.
Very heavy traditions and stuff along those
traditions,
lines.
You know, saying the rosary, saying prayers.
Gotcha.
You know, it's
and your mother herself had also converted to Catholicism when she married. And how did that influence any of your family's religious traditions, maybe prior or afterwards?
Well, my mother observed Catholicism, and she was, you know, Catholic from her marriage. But she, if there was an event at the Baptist church, she would continue to go. You know, there was a real line of demarcation between Catholics and non-Catholics about attending church and so forth, and at that time, and my mother just basically ignored that. She was part of the community, and she went to whatever the events.
More of like a Christian umbrella rather than a specific denomination.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Yeah. And so my her parents, when they came from the Netherlands, had a Dutch Reformed church, which is aligned with the Presbyterians and so forth.
Yeah.
And you, in a Protestant church, you take your letter to the new church to show that you're, a good person here. And the East Grange Baptist Church would not accept the letter from a Reformed church. They wouldn't. They wouldn't do it. So my grandmother Palma burned the letter, and they attended that church, but they were never asked to be members again. They just their children were members. My Uncle Ralph Palma was and cousin Arthur Palma were members, but they'd been turned down once, so they refused to apply for membership again.
Wow. And then, kind of the topic of religion as well. You alluded to it at the beginning of this interview. Can you share more about the story of the Rickey family who lived down the road from you?
Right. The Rickeys lived in a brick house on the crossroad on the West Transit Church Road, just over from Latin Road. Yeah, and they were there when the Morriseys moved in, and they're both Catholic families. Peter Rickey Sr. had come from, and his wife had come from Italy. And this is 1929, 1930. The Ku Klux Klan was active, and they decided to burn a cross in the Rickey's yard. And one of the neighbors came to my grandfather Morrisey and said he didn't want him to be offended, that the Irish Catholic Democrats had moved up a notch, and it was the Italian Catholic Democrats that were now the target of this. Well, he was offended. It was a shameful thing when you got a cross burned to your yard, but they went ahead and burned it.
So they had a terrible trifecta. They were immigrants, they were Catholic, and they were Italian.
And Democrats on top of it.
You got
everything. You had all of it.
Which at that time definitely not would have been welcomed as much. And with stories such as this, such as the cross burning, how did that affect your view of the community or shape perhaps your identity growing up, knowing that these sorts of things happened maybe 50 feet away from where you had lived?
Yeah, you're conscious of it, and you know that some of your neighbors are the ones doing it. It was not a cheery thought.
Knowing that some person might actually be the big bad wolf or something in disguise. It's a terrible thing to kind of wrestle with. And then when it comes to any things that you've experienced on the farm, what can you tell me about the story with Jack Robinson, the former mayor of Albion, and perhaps maybe the Cowboys buying hay?
Jack Robinson was married to a first cousin of my father's. And I was just thinking about this. I'm going to tell another story that they married in the Catholic Church. Jack was Episcopal. And then he had a row with the local Monsignor, I think it was Monsignor McCabe, and the family went to the Episcopal Church. And the older children had been baptized in the Catholic Church. And my father's Aunt Hannah Sullivan, when the next children were born, decided that this Episcopal baptism wasn't good enough. That she was going to sneak over and have them baptized secretly Catholic when she was babysitting, and would, so there were two baptisms for several of the Robinson children, one in the Episcopal Church, one in the Catholic Church. And I'm going to tell two stories here. My grandmother Morrisey was a Sullivan, and she had 4 brothers, all of whom died before their father did, dead by their by the 20s. One was a gun cleaning accident. One was worked in the quarries, and the dust from the quarries got your lungs. And another one died under the cars in a railroad incident of some sort. It was just
awful.
Impulsive men.
Yeah.
And so of the 7 Sullivan children, 2, my grandmother had 2 children, and one of her sisters had 2 children. There's only 2 lines of descent there. But anyway, one of those Sullivan relatives married Jack Robinson. He was mayor of Albion. He was a businessman, and he raised pacers and standardbred horses. And the one time he sent a truck and 2 men down to buy hay from my father, and I'm out there, my uncle, my father, and I, and these two cowboys working for Jack Robinson are there to get the hay. And you didn't need 3 people up in the barn. You're dropping the hay down from
Yeah.
the mow, and then they're loading it down on the truck. So I'm going to stay down and help load the truck. And my father said, no, get up in the barn. I didn't understand at the time what was going on. I knew he wanted me up in the barn, and he wanted to make sure that if that load shifted, I wasn't to blame for it. That the two Robinson workers who had stacked that, they were the ones to blame for if it shifted. He wasn't going to have anybody else down there to blame for it. And got the truck loaded, and the guys left. And about half an hour later, the phone rings, and Jack's on the phone. Where's that crew with the hay? And my Uncle Jay Morrisey answers the phone and said, well, they left over half an hour ago, and if they went up on the Kyler Road, there's an underpass there.
Oh boy.
And you could hear Jack roar at the other end of the phone. He had quite a temper. Now they hadn't done that. They taken the zigzag road, and the load shifted, so they had to reload it. So they did dump the load, and I wasn't to blame for it. My hands were clean on that one.
Oh, that's amazing. And then when you mentioned in the past about working on the farm, or particularly in the barn, you mentioned these low maple beams. And you and I were both taller gentlemen, and especially being taller than the rest of the family. What was it like doing that kind of work, and perhaps maybe the heat influence that?
I mean, the inside the barns on a hot day, just to bake, there's no circulation, so it would just brutally hot in there, and you'd haul the hay across, and like I said, my father and uncle would walk under these beams. I had to duck each time. So you go and duck and then come back and duck. Then you finally forgot to duck, and kabam! Oh, you just see stars there on that. That was brutal in those barns, trying to get that done.
Sure, you and I have hit our heads a few too many times.
Yeah, show the effects of it here. I can tell one more Jack Robinson story. He'd come back from the farm at Eagle Harbor, and he'd been shooting woodchucks, and he goes to start a fire in the fireplace, and he's leaning over, and a couple of bullets fell out of his pocket into where he's going to start the fire, and he lights it and goes off, and his wife Helen is standing there by the mantle, and the fire heats up the bullet, and she gets shot in the butt. And Jack says, well, if you'd been out in the kitchen getting my supper ready, you wouldn't have gotten hit.
Oh my God.
A very sympathetic man here.
Yeah, very much so.
It was like the old honeymooners on TV.
And similarly with, the heat in the barn, what was it like working when it was incredibly hot out? Especially, we're about to have a very big heat spell coming up soon, and working out in those kinds of conditions, what was it like?
You just had to do it. Just had to have fluid, whatever, and the old get out there before it gets hot was the theory on the farm, and I knew it was already hot, but it was going to get hotter, so you'd be out there at 5, 6 in the morning trying to get as much done as you could, and if you got things done, you sat up on in the front lawn of the farmhouse, which had big trees. And there's always a breeze there, so you'd get the adults would get some beer out. The rest of us got lemonade and something cold there to drink. So you try and get fluids. Yeah.
And then you mentioned earlier the farmhand who would often work on the breezy side of the wagon. What was the dynamic like with those kinds of or hired farmhands? Like how'd that operate?
Well, there was a man named Louis Harper. Louis Harper was from Florida. He was black. And he always worked for my father. He worked for my father for years. And they always knew if Louis said, see y'all in the morning, he was coming. If he didn't say that, he wasn't coming. Whether he said he was coming or not didn't matter. And, but he was just, I've talked to people from the South, and the black migrants always referred to my father and uncle as Mr. Homer, Mr. J. And in the South where there was a plantation, the boss man was the owner of the plantation, and the sons of the owner were always called, Mr. Bob, Mr. Joe. But because my father was out there on the tractor, he wasn't an overseer. He was right there
alongside.
Yeah, he was running things, but he was alongside. So he was Mr. Homer, and his brother was Mr. J, and I was just Gerard. I had no
title.
no title, no status. I just I was a fellow worker out there, but that always Mr. Homer and Mr. J. That was the how they were addressed.
And then you've been involved with the Cobblestone Museum here for a while and stuff along those lines. How did you first become interested in history and get involved with the stuff that we have here at the museum?
It was just fascinating, the stories to be told, and there were different people I knew lived in cobblestone houses, and you'd hear historic stories and so forth.
Very nice. And then in the past, you mentioned that you were a scoutmaster. What was your experience like as a scoutmaster, and how has it influenced your connection to the community?
Well, the Baptist Church at East Gaines had a scout troop, Troop 42, which I was in, and you went to summer camp. There were just experiences there that were there, and then I became the scoutmaster. And the thing I learned, you could have kids in your troop who could disrupt a meeting. You could have a meeting and they could just drive you crazy for an hour. You went to summer camp and you had all week, and you could wear them down. I remember the one kid, he's supposed to be the waiter up at the mess hall, and he's throwing a fit. He's not going to go up there. He's going to show me. So all the other kids are going over. You got to do something. You got to tell him to go up there. And I said, no, I've got a car. I can go to a restaurant in town. I won't starve. And if he doesn't go up there, he's not going to eat either. And so he went storming around. And I wasn't going to take the bait. I wasn't going to do this.
Give the satisfaction.
It just, not going to force him to go do that. He's going to end up hungry too. And finally it's quiet around. I said, where'd he go? He went up and just looking for a fight, and if he just did, week-long camp, you could outlast him.
And as someone that's deeply rooted in this area, what do you think has changed the most about the community throughout your lifetime?
Well, there's less connection. I don't know my neighbors, and with the smaller farms, and you knew all your neighbors. My father would always leave the keys to the pickup truck in it all night. In case somebody broke down, they didn't have to come to the house. They knew that they could just drive that pickup truck and return it. That was the accepted way things were done. We're much more isolated.
Yeah, it's weird to think about that kind of dynamic and stuff. How do you think, beyond maybe having keys in the truck, that sort of connection has changed and altered? How have you seen it kind of bridge or branch out?
Well, the individual farmers couldn't farm alone in the old days. They had to have help.
Yeah.
On certain things, you just had to have help. And the size of modern farming, I mean, you hauled grain to Agway or to wherever the old GLF or whatever it was, where they had the big grain mills, grain silos, and now these individual farms have just gigantic storage bins. Beyond belief. No farmer I knew had a scale, a truck scale, and I would say a majority of these large farmers have truck scales now. That they operate on that level, and they have their own people that do the repairs. They can buy equipment directly from the manufacturers. They don't have to go through a local farm input dealer, and the buildings are gigantic, and so they're not dependent on their neighbors to help out.
Gotcha. And then one of the last questions that I have for you, Throughout everything that you've experienced throughout your life and the questions that you've answered today, what does it mean to you to be a local of Orleans County? The significance of that word and what it means to be a part of this community.
Well, you have a connection, you know a little bit, and I'm 75 now, and I suddenly I can remember things that people don't remember. I was 10 years old when dial telephones came.
Wow.
They got rid of the operators. I mean, things just, and now the next generation doesn't know what a dial telephone is.
Not wrong.
That's the technology has jumped. I remember the story, and I got to tell the story of my mother's father, Gerard Morrisey. And when they shifted over to a dial telephone, my mother went over there to try and teach your father how you dial to zero to get the operator. There was still an operator.
The rotary.
The rotary phone.
Yep.
And she wasn't going to try to teach him to dial the phone. Just in an emergency, you dial and you get the operator. There'd be an operator there.
Yeah.
And he just, no. Jenny will do that. His wife, Jenny,
wasn't having it.
Wouldn't touch the thing. It was too complicated. And no, Jenny can do that. Only other thing, if Jenny's unconscious on the floor, what are you going to do? And he wouldn't touch it. And he was a man who could take a piece of equipment around, old farm equipment, put it back together, rebuild it, build a building. He should have patented the water for the stock. He just took a hinge and a spring, and you stuck your nose in there, and the water ran. That should have been patented. And so the stock had their own water. The pipe broke to the house, and his wife had to haul a bucket out to the barn. The stock got fed automatically, but Jenny had to haul a bucket. So just that changeover.
That's amazing. That concludes the questions that I had for you. Are there any stories or any anecdotes that you'd like to share before we conclude the interview?
Yeah, I'm sure there are, but I've forgotten them already. But that's about it. I'm
Alrighty.
brain cramp.
Well, thank you very much for your time today,
All right,
Gerard.
Collin, thank you.
Of course.